So welcome to the second part of our second day of lectures at the Vienna Academy of Visionary Art. And we just looked at the figure's proportion throughout history. Now we're going to focus on the pose, and specifically the humanist figure and the pose of the humanist figure. In a previous lecture, I made this division between hieratic and humanist styles, saying that the art of Hindu and Buddhism and Egypt and several other traditions like Mayan art is very hieratic because it tends to show you very stilled, centered figures, whereas in Greek times and the Renaissance we have a more humanist tradition. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today, is this humanist tradition of the pose. And it first dawned on me when I was in Rome, in the Vatican, and looking at The Last Judgment by Michelangelo. And I was basically stunned and blown away by the beauty and grandeur of this fresco. But on the other hand, I couldn't really see it that well with all of the distractions that you have. And so I bought myself a poster and I started to do a series of visual meditations on this composition. And what dawned on me was the way Michelangelo uses the movement, the pose of, say, this central figure like Christ, and raising one arm to show the wound in his hand and the response that you get, and lowering the other hand where these then are forgiven for the crucifixion, and so they rise up in this way, they fall in that way. There is this huge movement just within the central figure of Christ, but also that moves through the whole fresco. And if you know The Last Judgment as a theme in Gothic cathedrals, Christ sits with both hands raised like this to show his wounds, and there's no movement. It's very static. Whereas what makes this unique is the energy and movement in the fresco. And I want to look at that energy and movement that you see in the Western figure. Michelangelo himself was strongly inspired by this classical Greek fragment that had been discovered, this torso, called the Torso Belvedere. And in fact, he most likely incorporated the Torso Belvedere in Christ. So you have this classical Greek statue being incorporated into Christianity, specifically during the Renaissance. So obviously, there's some kind of continuity, we know this, between ancient Greek times and the Renaissance, and we're going to look at that continuity. Now, in order to better understand Michelangelo, one thing that I did is I drew one of his figures. This is from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, what's called an ignudo, a nude figure which is supporting or buttressing the main Sibyl or prophet. And looking at that figure and drawing it, I became aware of how, for example, this leg was just hanging down very loosely, and that gravity was influencing it as all the muscles relaxed, and with the relaxation of the muscles, the leg just dropped. On this leg, there seemed to be two forces at work, that all of these muscles were tensing, and all of these muscles were relaxed, and there was these two forces moving through the figure, and as they moved, you had a force moving upward around the figure, and meanwhile gravity was still coming down. And I became very aware of these two forces at work in the figure, especially in the West. I called them force and gravity, but in another sense you can call it will and repose, and even more so, the soul and the body. And I'm going to show that this is not just my imagination, but that this is the way artists thought of the human figure in ancient Greece and in the Renaissance. That there was always these two forces at work in the body, will and repose, which translate into the soul and the body itself. Another point I want, before I make that other point, I then, just by chance, I'd selected a figure which happens to be almost the same pose as the Cumaean Sibyl, which is also on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But the Cumaean Sibyl has drapery. And I was very intrigued to discover how Michelangelo used that drapery to, in a certain sense, draw the invisible lines of force and gravity, which I myself had been drawing on that nude figure. And I would suggest that maybe when you think of drapery, and certainly the way Michelangelo thought of drapery is giving you that lines of energy that move through the figure. The other principle that I want to emphasize during this talk is illustrated by these two works by Michelangelo, the original drawing and the actual fresco. And you can see that in the original drawing, he was working out the placement of every muscle on every bone and the anatomy, which muscles were tensing, which muscles were relaxed, and so on. But when it came time to actually make the fresco, he was glossing over, smoothing, eliminating a lot of those finer points, and doing that for good reason, because your eye gets lost in all the bulges and bones and muscles, and it actually, you have lifelikeness, and again, this will be an important principle that we'll come across. You have lifelikeness, but it lacks the quality of the ideal human figure. And to achieve the ideal human figure, you have to simplify, you have to reduce. So you've got this contrast between anatomy and style. The more you strive towards realistic depiction of anatomy, the less you stylize the figure. The more you gloss over the anatomy, the more you get the stylization of the figure. And you can see that again and again when you go from Michelangelo's drawings, which are beautiful, to his frescoes, which simplify again and again. So in ancient Greece, we'll come across to zotikon, zoe meaning life in ancient Greek, hence the word zoology, for example, or a zoo. And zotikon then is the quality of life, the life-likeness. That on the one hand, the Greeks were striving for to zotikon, but on the other hand, from Plato, you have the idea of the ideal forms, the higher forms of which everything down here is a physical imitation or shadow. But the ideal form, which he called the ide, or eidos, is the one that is so perfect that it is absolute. And everything is nothing but an example here below. So let's go back to ancient Greece, and ancient Greece has been commonly divided into three periods. The archaic period from 800 to 500, where you have these Kouros statues. Then the classical period, 500 to 323 BC, which is your typically classical image of Greek sculpture. But in the time of Alexander the Great, the art changed and shifted to what's now called the Hellenistic period, and now you will see that there was a shift towards greater dramatic expression. So let's take that one by one, starting with the Kouros figures in the archaic style. And now this is from roughly 600 BC, that period lasted until 400, and they are following very much the same philosophy as the ancient Egyptians. This Egyptian statue is from 2400 BC, and you can see he's clutching his hands close to his sides, very much like the Greek Kouros. He has 1 foot forward, the Kouros has 1 foot forward. There is a strong symmetry to the figure, there's no bends, right? So this early period of Greek statuary we can call hieratic, that they were very much following the hieratic principles of the human figure. Richard Neer has written a book, The Emergence of the Classical Style in Greek Sculpture, and he spends a lot of time looking at the Kouros and the way how this influenced the classical style. Most discussions of Kouroi note their peculiar timelessness. They are oddly intermediate, neither walking nor standing still. Frozen and immobile, weight distributed with perfect evenness over both legs, the Kouros, in fact, seems somehow outside time. So that's the hieratic quality, if you want. In the late 1970s, Eleanor Goralnik measured 24 of these Kouroi statues and determined that at least 2/3 were carved in accord with the Egyptian late period grid of 21 squares. And we saw that in Diodorus Siculus when he wrote in his text that, in fact, the Kouroi was following this Egyptian grid system. So it even has Egyptian proportions to it. It doesn't have the Egyptian anatomy or stylization, slightly, but we can identify this as Greek, we can identify that as Egyptian, and so styles move around proportion in different ways in different periods of time. Now what happened is this statue was found near the Acropolis. We date it to roughly 480 BC, we're not sure, and it seems to hallmark a revolution in the Greek approach to the figure. It's called the Critian boy because it's attributed to a sculptor named Critios. For the first time, we see that bend in the hip. So rather than having a perfectly symmetrical figure around the plumb line, now the hip shifts to one side. The shoulders actually are level. So it's not what we will call the contrapposto. We use another name, moderate ponderation, a slight bend. And with this slight bend, we've moved into a new stage of Greek sculpture, the early classical style. The figure moves as a whole. There's a cohesion in the body. And the anatomy is so constructed as to allow the eye to follow it. There's a smooth curve that goes from the hip all the way down to the knee. What's called the iliac crest, that line over there, is emphasized. It's the emergence of the iliac crest, which is going to become so important in Greek sculpture. There's also the emergence of other key points, like the prominent ridge between the eyebrows and the nose. Another statue from that time period, and we only have the head, called the Blonde Boy, also shows this, that for the first time you get the strongly rounded chin, you get the bow shape in the smile, you get these sharp lines coming here to define the ridge of the nose and the brow. The hair also is stylized in a way that it wasn't before during the Archaic period. That's the revolution that's symbolized or manifest by the Critian boy. Now, the Critian boy is a statue from the Acropolis. So the statues that were on the facades of their temples were stone statues. But typically the freestanding statues in ancient Greece were made of bronze. And any authentic Greek freestanding statue was bronze. We're fortunate that from the bottom of the sea, we've managed to bring up these statues, and they're bronzes. So these are the original Greek bronze statues in the classical style. And you can see the emergence of the classical style. The emergence of these sharp, prominent ridges that define the anatomy, including the iliac crest and so on. So here we have the beginnings of this classical style, but we don't have really a strong contrapposto. Both feet here are pressed flat to the ground, if you notice. He's got one heel up, but that's mostly because of the motion that he's in. It's either Poseidon or Zeus, one or the other, throwing a spear. We're not sure which. Then we come to the Doryphorus by Polykleitos. And this statue was revolutionary, not just because of proportion. In the last lecture, we looked at it in terms of the proportion, the canon, but in terms of the pose. It's really the statue that gives us the contrapposto pose. And contrapposto is an Italian word. It basically means the counterpoise. The Greeks didn't have a word to describe the pose. The Greek word for pose is simply schema, or multiple schemata. So they would speak of the schema of a sculpture, the pose. But scholars later have spoken of the chiastic principle from chi, which is the X in the Greek language. The idea being that you have one straight line and one curving line, and the straight and the curving line give you the X, or chi, and hence it's this chiastic principle that moves through the statue. And more than that though, the contrapposto, the counterpoise, is that you have this balance of opposing forces within the body. And that balance of opposing forces starts when you lift the heel. And the moment you lift the heel, and I really invite you to do this at home sometime, is stand perfectly straight, as if you're doing yoga, and just lift one heel and see what happens. And you'll see that you start to fall over, so you raise your hand to balance yourself out, and your hip turns and your shoulders turn, and pretty soon you've got this energy curving through what was a perfectly static figure. When you were symmetrical, you were static, you were stationary. But now, movement, energy is flowing through the figure. And where is it flowing? It's flowing from the weight-bearing foot. It crosses at roughly the pubis, the halfway point, and then it releases itself either in the gesture of the hand or the movement of the eye. And the movement, the glance, right? All of the energy in the body is being released through either the glance or the gesture. That's what gives Western art its powerful expressivity, the expression of the face, the expression of the hand. It's born right here. Sorry for this long text. I don't have a lot of long texts, but I came across this text from Xenophon in a book called Memorabilia. And to me, when I read that text, I realized it was a key text for understanding Greek sculpture. It's basically a dialogue between Socrates and a sculptor who is called Cleiton, and probably he means Polykleitos. So we have to imagine this dialogue between the greatest philosopher before Plato, Socrates, and the greatest sculptor, Polykleitos, and what they have to say to each other. As we'll soon learn, Socrates dominates the conversation, and all Polykleitos does is say, yes, okay, fine. So let's begin. And I've emphasized certain key points, which I'll then look at over here. Socrates entered the workshop of the sculptor Cleiton, which is to say Polykleitos, and said, "Tell me, Cleiton, how do you give the magic touch of life to your creations? Is it by closely imitating the forms of living beings that you succeed in giving them their lifelikeness?" Cleiton says, "No doubt." Socrates continues, is it not by faithfully copying the various muscular contractions of the body, in obedience to the play of gesture and poise, the tensions and the relaxations, that you succeed in making your statues like real beings, make them breathe, as people say?" Cleiton answers, "Without a doubt." Socrates continues, "And does not the faithful imitation of the various affections of the body, when engaged in any action, impart a particular pleasure to the beholder?" Cleiton, "I should say so." Socrates, "Then the threatenings in the eyes of warriors engaged in battle should be carefully copied. Or again, you should imitate the aspect of a conqueror, radiant with success." Cleiton says, "Above all things." So Socrates says, "It would seem that the sculptor is also called upon to incorporate in his ideal form the workings and energies then of the soul." And unfortunately, the dialogue breaks off there, but all the essential points have been made. And what are those essential points? Well, first of all, he talks about imitating imitation. This becomes a key word. In Aristotle, his Poetics, it's all about mimesis, imitation, that art imitates nature. And this then becomes a subject for debate. Does art imitate nature, or does art strive for some higher ideal? Well, if you imitate nature, you get this quality of lifelikeness, and there it is, to zotikon. He mentions it explicitly. A statue should have lifelikeness. And how do you achieve the lifelikeness in a statue? Well, he goes on to talk about the contractions of the body, the muscular contractions and the affectations of the body, which is to say, the expressions in the face. Now, in the Platonic period of philosophy in ancient Greece, affections, which are the passions of the soul, were not considered to be very positive. In other words, when the body surrenders to anger, when the body surrenders to fear, when the body surrenders to pleasure, these were all viewed in a fairly negative way in the Platonic philosophy. Because the soul is like the rider of the horse. The soul is supposed to control and keep the human being in a state of equilibrium. And if you give yourself over to excess passion, you're surrendering to the body. The soul is surrendering to the body. So this was viewed as a negative thing. And the question is, in sculpture, what are we striving to express? Are we striving to express the affections, the passions of the body, or something much higher? And that's where Socrates, towards the end, says, in his ideal form, the sculptor should show us the workings and energies of the soul. Now, I'm going to give you this one little quote from Plato, the Phaedro, where he's talking about what is the soul and how do we know what the soul is. And he says, "We shall feel no scruple in affirming that what is precisely the essence and definition of soul is, to wit, self-motion. Any body that has an eternal source of motion is soulless, but a body deriving its motion from a source within itself is animate or besouled." So here we come to this idea again of the will, right? The moment the will moves through the body, then we have evidence of the soul. And so whenever there is a gesture, a movement, a glance, this is evidence of the soul moving through the body. And that's where we get this idea of the play of gesture and poise, the tensions and relaxations. He mentions this explicitly in the dialogue, that when you get tension, you get the will moving through the muscles and acting. But when you get relaxation, you get the body itself, the body surrendering to gravity, repose, and so on. So those are the two things at work within the figure. Now we come back to the contrapposto when we start to understand what Polykleitos was getting at with this pose. That by giving us all the tensions in one leg and then the other leg relaxed, and then that tension crosses over as he grasps the spear, but the other arm hangs down relaxed on the opposite side, right? And then finally, that tension from here to here to here in the burst of the eye, we are seeing the expression of the soul in sculpture, perhaps for the first time, or at least through movement, through gesture, and so on. J.J. Polite has written this wonderful book, Art and Experience in Classical Greece, and he writes, "A dancer moving in time with music performed specific steps called eremiai, in which the body was held for an instant in characteristic positions. The positions were rhythmoi, patterns, isolated within the continual movement. A single well-chosen rhythmos could convey the whole nature of a movement." So that gives us the idea that the pose, the schema in Greek, is an arrested movement, or rhythmos, combining repose with the intention of action. And there's been a long debate about this statue as to whether it is actually walking or whether it's standing still. And we'll come to that in a moment. But even in terms of the time that we see, what we're seeing is what other authors have called an arrested movement combining repose with the intention of action, or the pregnant moment, the movement that has just slipped into the past or will at any moment come to be. It's that stillness. He's not moving. He's about to move. This is the key. And when you're going to draw a figure according to the sacred codes of the Western humanist style, yes, later we will find figures in action. But at this point, the classical period, what makes the classical period unique is that they're actually standing still. They're about to move. The intention to move is there, but they're not actually moving. So this gives the statue what we can call poise. And poise is a word we usually associate with dancers, right? He still has to be balanced. He must maintain perfect balance because he's standing still. He's standing still. The moment he acts, he actually falls off balance because he's acting. But in this case, he has established a point of balance on that weight-bearing foot. And so in the world of dance, the word that best describes a more dynamic form of balance is this French word aplomb. And aplomb, plomb meaning the weight, being exactly on it, that you are falling exactly on the plumb line. So here's the plumb line, and he is manifesting a sense of aplomb, that he is standing and focusing his weight and balance on that point. Okay. So I call this the unmoved movement of classical Greek statues. Now, remember the Kouros figure, and remember how the Kouros figure actually had one foot in front of the other? And the way Richard Neer described it is he said that this figure was immobile. It was neither standing nor walking. And Neer wants to make the point that this peculiar pose, which you get from ancient Egyptian times, and then moving forward into the archaic Greek, is this idea that even though one foot is forward, he's not actually moving, he's not actually walking, he's actually standing still. But he's about to move, and that's the point. Kenneth Clark, one of the great historians of art, writes in The Nude, Polykleitos' first problem was to find some means by which the figure should combine repose with the suggestion of potential movement. Polykleitos invented a pose in which the figure is neither walking nor standing, but simply establishing a point of balance. And that is what is revolutionary about that statue. So that brings us to the definition of classical beauty. And there is a famous oracle or sanctuary at Delphi, which Apollo rules over, the oracle at Delphi. And there are two inscriptions in that temple. One, Gnathi Sauton, know thyself. And the other, Maiden Agan, which is to say all things in moderation. And this, in a sense, sums up the classical ideal. For the classical ideal, you had to know yourself, which was to say there was this interior awareness. And this interior awareness becomes one of the key factors of classical sculpture, that they have an inner life, they have a soul, which we don't see so much in the earlier sculptures. And the other thing is the moderation, that you don't do anything to excess, that there's a balanced temperament, an inner equilibrium, and a calm restraint in the figure. So when we start to look at sculpture from the classical style, and for example, this famous Knidos Aphrodite, where as the story goes, and this is a story from Pliny, Praxiteles, who is the creator of the statue, created two versions of the statue for the citizens of Kos, one draped and the other nude. And when the citizens of Kos saw the nude statue, they rejected it. But the citizens of Knidos admired it, set it up in their open-air temple, and it became a famous statue. And this is the first nude statue of a woman in ancient Greece. Males, as we saw from the period of the Kouros statues, the male warrior or athlete nude was a standard in ancient Greek culture from the beginning. But female nudes was something new, and this is the first female nude. Now, it's called the Venus pudica as well because she's expressing pudeur. She's covering her sex and showing, the drapery has dropped off. She's about to either step into or out of her bath, and she's nude, but she's covering her nudity. But she's still aware of her nudity, and she's not expressing extreme emotion of like, oh my God, I'm naked. Rather there's a calm, quiet repose to her response to her own nudity. And this is then a fragment of that statue where you don't even have the arms anymore. And you can see how there is a certain erotic quality to the statue, even though it's expressing a timidity or a conservative view of nudity in a woman. Other examples of classical style then, Praxiteles was one of the late great practitioners of the classical style, and you can see that he's following the principles that we've laid out in terms of the contrapposto, but also in terms of expression. And the other late great examples then, Lysippus, the scraper. Athletes would scrape off the sweat from their skin, and that's what he's doing. And the famous Apollo Belvedere, which we don't know who sculpted it, but it's one of the greatest statues. This one was fairly unique because his arm is thrusting outward, and he didn't respect, so to speak, the shape of the block. For the first time, a figure breaks out of the standard block shape that surrounded them. So let's move now to the Hellenistic period, and right away you can see the shift that happens in the Hellenistic period. No more restraint, rather extreme postures, extreme twists of the body that we see in the Laocoon. Also, anatomy is not just this softly, delicately rendered shapes and forms and curves, but full-on Farnese, Hercules anatomy expressing itself to the full. In the female figure, the nude is also prevalent, and now she assumes a variety of poses, lying down, crouching, as well as the famous Venus de Milo in the Louvre, the standing nude, with that contrapposto curve. But at the same time in the Hellenistic period, you also get statues like these of the old washerwoman or a drunken old woman. And now you're getting all of the character, what was called the ethos in ancient Greek. All the ethos or characters coming out in the face. And we're not striving towards some higher ideal of beauty, but rather the naturalistic and accurate tozotikon depiction of human life. The dying gladiator, okay, he's in a position of suffering. This one over here, the Gaul killing his wife and himself. No more do we have a restraint that we used to have in the classical period. Instead, it's sacrificed in favor of tragic pathos or exaggerated expression and anatomy. So I'm going to finish off this presentation of ancient Greek sculpture, and specifically Hellenistic sculpture, with these two prime examples. And this one, the Borghese gladiator, there is not one muscle that is in a state of relaxation or repose. Rather, every muscle is present, every muscle is tensed. It is the ultimate expression of the will. He normally had a shield at the top of his arm. You can't see the other hand, but it holds a knife, and he's about to thrust that knife up into the other gladiator which we cannot see. So everything has to do with tenseness, will, action. And then you contrast that with the Barberini faun. And now here's this faun. He's probably had a bit too much to drink, or maybe he had the milk of the opium poppy, we don't know. But he's surrendered himself to slumber. And he is also surrendered to absolute repose, the body. It's the opposite of will. It's ultimate repose and surrender to the energies of the body. So the Hellenistic period, if you want, took that balance of forces that we saw in the Doryphoros and split it into its extreme forms. And you see it in the case of these two statues. All right, let's jump ahead through time and history to the Renaissance. And one of the interesting things about the Renaissance, it was not just the rebirth of classical Greek style, but also the nude. And it is interesting how the nude was viewed during the Renaissance. This is Masaccio, The Fall. In his original version, actually, you could see Adam and Eve naked. Later, it was covered over by the owner of the chapel because it was considered indecent, even though we're talking about Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve, there's a medieval definition of nudity, nuditas naturalis. This was the naked Adam and Eve ashamed by their fallen state. That was contrasted even in medieval times with nuditas virtualis, and that's more of the classical nude, a god or a hero as the ideal form of humanity. And this distinction between naked and nude is even preserved in the English language, as it is in German between Akt and Nackt. Nackt being naked, Akt being a nude figure. The emphasis being that the nude is permissible because the nude is the higher ideal form, whereas a naked figure would just be manifesting Adam and Eve in their fallen state. So these are the first nude works in the Renaissance. Donatello, his David, the first male nude, a statue, and Botticelli's famous Venus being the first female nude, even though she is covering herself very much like the Venus Pudica. Savonarola, he was the great opponent to any form of art, and especially nudity in art. And he was eventually burned at the stake for his extreme views, but he was very influential. And Botticelli, for example, listened very strongly to what Savonarola had to say and turned away from the nude in his works. Michelangelo, on the other hand, was kind of stuck in the middle. Half the time he was thinking Savonarola was right, and half the time something within him rebelled, and rebelled very strongly. And his Sistine Chapel is the ultimate example of nudity in the Renaissance pushed to the extreme. So much so that this fellow, Biagio de Cesena, protested to the Pope saying that it should be destroyed. And the Pope said, no, Michelangelo knows what he's doing. So Michelangelo put him just about to enter the mouth of hell in the very bottom of the fresco. And on the other hand, there was such a strong outcry against the nudity in the Last Judgment that even in Michelangelo's lifetime, his former assistant, Daniel de Volterra, covered over the figures, that they put slight drapery over the figures, that they were all totally nude, and we can see this in this copy by Marcello Venusti. And from the totally nude figures, drapery was added. And Daniel de Volterra had to go to certain extremes sometimes. For example, he was nude, she was nude, and they were in a rather uncompromising position as well. she was looking at him and he was looking at her, so Daniel de Volterra actually turned the head as well as covering them with drapery and so on. Michelangelo was an interesting character without a doubt, and he was playing a lot, I think, in that fresco. Giovanni Bellini had two apprentices, one being Giorgione, the other being Titian, and Giorgione, a Venetian painter, is credited with the first reclining nude, which you see up here. And then Titian followed quickly thereafter, and the reclining female nude then became a standard within art history. And you can think of the sleeping Ariadne from classical times, but she's draped. In the Hellenistic period, there were reclining nude figures, but not quite so obviously nude as you see here. So, the Renaissance contrapposto. As you can see, Michelangelo had studied the archaic works, the Greek classical works, and studied them well. He understood the principles that we were just talking about. He understood that all of the weight falls onto one foot, the heel of the other foot goes up, movement and repose shift through the body. Here, this leg is tensed, this arm is tensed, but this one's relaxed and this one's relaxed, right? And that creates that S-curve which explodes in that glance that you get from his famous David statue. But he was not the only one. Mantegna with his painting of Saint Sebastian, although it's very much like a statue, and Perugino here with his Apollo, they all understand the principles at work in classical Greek sculpture and are applying it to their works. Let's come back to this amazing fresco, and we've looked at Christ in the center here. Let's now look at John the Baptist, who's on this axis turning to look at Christ, and let's look at St. Peter over here, also on another axis turning to look at Christ. Obviously, two very important principal figures in the fresco. Now, John the Baptist, he's put all of his weight on this one foot, and he's turning, but someone's holding him back, and so this leg falls back, and it creates this curve. So you have this tremendous movement around the plumb line as he gazes upon Christ. St. Peter is doing very much the same thing, but his whole shoulder has now shifted over the plumb line. And when we move from a contrapposto to a twist, which is even more extreme, contrapposto is like a lateral movement in the body. This is called the serpentinata, the figura serpentinata, where there's a spiral that happens. And the spiral happens that the figure moves like a spiral around the plumb line. And that is a term which came from Bellori, an art critic from the late Renaissance, early Baroque period, describing these figures in Michelangelo as serpentinata, or serpent-like figures. So in the same way that there's this evolution of the contrapposto in the Greek period from the moderate ponderation of the Critios boy to the contrapposto of the Doryphorus to this extreme torsion of the Laocoon, twisting, not just laterally turning, but twisting, we see the same thing in Michelangelo, where the David has this soft lateral movement that starts to turn until it becomes this extreme twist, as you see in these are both unfinished statues by Michelangelo, but his David as Apollo here and his Hercules and Cacus over there. The extreme torsion and bending and turning that you get in these figures leads to what's called the Mannerist and Baroque periods, where all restraint is thrown to the winds and you get these stylistic extremes. We saw how will and repose become split in the late Hellenistic period, The two slaves by Michelangelo, which were intended for the monument, the funerary monument, these were supposed to stand on either side of a doorway, in a doorway to death, basically, and this is their response to death. And one slave, called the rebellious slave, who's bound by cords, is straining with every muscle and limb that he has in order to free himself from his bound state. Whereas the other one, called commonly the dying slave, is a standing figure, but standing in such a way as to manifest total repose, relaxation, surrendering itself over to death. And Michelangelo, with these two figures, has, in a certain sense, come to the same development as we see in the Hellenistic period of splitting will and repose into two contrary figures. All right, I would like to finish this talk with one of my favorite artists, Blake. And Blake was obviously following these traditions, following Michelangelo, but he had also drawn the Laocoon, and he understood very well classical culture. This is his version of the Last Judgment, and he writes, "The Last Judgment and its vision is seen by the eye of everyone according to the situation he holds." And I would suggest that he's very clearly giving you an eye at the top over here with a triangle of vision coming down, and this is one way to behold all of creation. And at the bottom there seems to be what's remaining of some kind of an eye with its own darker perspective from below moving upward onto the creation. And here the figures are rising up to be one with the eye of God and Christ in the middle. Here, like tears, they're falling down into the shadowy fire and flames of the underworld. Now, what's so beautiful about Blake is the way he takes figures and pushes them to their extremes. Let's look at this figure over here, who is standing before the book where the names of the saved are inscribed, and this figure over here, who is standing and pointing towards the other book where the names of the damned are inscribed. I'm going to zoom in. And you can see we're back. He's learned his lessons from Michelangelo, specifically the John the Baptist, where one leg falls behind the other, and around that plumb line there's a beautiful turning and twisting of the figure, which explodes in the glance of the eye, and there it goes. And then he's taken that, which is a fairly restrained curve, and pushed it in this figure, where the curve then becomes a much more energetic and powerful and moving curve. He understands how you can have restraint and you can have a figure that bursts those bonds and restraints to express itself. Coming back, I now want to look at these two figures down here. There's a couple on this axis embracing, and there's another couple on this axis, and rather than embracing, they are totally in conflict with one another. And now, the way energy moves from one figure to the other, that there's not just one figure here, there's two, and there's a spiral of energy moving up, binding these two figures together. On the other hand, here's two more figures, also a spiral of energy, but this spiral is expressing conflict and division rather than unification and love, which you see over here. Very consciously aware of these comparisons. Another one then would be the couple embracing from above to below, and the couple here where one is being dragged down to hell. A vertical movement of energy through the figures. Not laterally, but the energy goes up, spirals, and continues ever higher as she draws him upward into the heavens. Whereas now you can see that the energy spiraling through the figure gets pulled down, and the energy is moving down in these two figures. It tells you what variety you can use in order to show figures in relationship to each other. Last one is to focus down here in the very eye of the beast itself, the seven-headed beast with 10 diadems on its head, being bound by the archangel Michael. And this figure itself is kind of amazing, with this multi-divided view onto the creation. But let's look at this angelic figure here and marvel at what Blake has done. We still have that plumb line, and this hind foot is definitely in profile. This is in frontal view. He's taken that foot in profile and turned the figure all the way around until the face is in the opposite profile. And then turn the arm again until the hand is in the opposite profile. He's created this extreme twist from one to the next, to the next, to the next in a single human figure. But done that gracefully, with amazing beauty and grace. And this is from the center then of that fresco. These two figures down here, I would like to zoom in on them just to give you an idea of how far Blake could go in his depiction of the human figure, the pose, and the way the pose can twist and contort. There's definitely a triangular structure to this one, right? There's energy moving through the figure and being released in a glance, but now that energy is becoming a spiral that's moving through the figure. Same thing with this one. He seems to be falling, turning, gazing this way. And once you understand, as Blake says, energy is eternal delight, you can eternally play with the energy moving through the figure. And that's what the West and Western art is kind of all about with its pose. Last two images I want to show you. This one, Christ by Blake being baptized. And just to say, you don't, now that you've understood those principles, you don't have to go to that extreme. That is actually the subtlety, the subtle shift of energy manifesting itself in that upward glance, which gives this figure its power. We've seen it to the extreme. Now, in its more subtle form, you see how the figure has power, cohesion, expression in a much more moderate way. And I want to finish with this one because coming back to this idea of the nude, when Blake does show us a nude such as Adam and Eve with the archangel Raphael, his female nude does not in any sense show shame. It's not the nuditas naturalis. Rather, he's understood the nuditas virtualis, that this is the ideal human figure in all its beauty and glory, with no shame whatsoever. And I think Blake has this amazing capacity to render the human figure not just in its pose, not just in its proportions and style, but also in its expression that shows liberty, freedom, and total spiritual expression of the inner soul of the human being. And I think that's a good place to end this talk. So, thank you very much.